This week we're going to be talking about MSG.
Mrs. G after the divorce.
What is MSG? Monosodium glutamate is the sodium salt of glutamic acid. Glutamates are responsible for the savoury, meaty flavours that we call umami.
I love umami. I love umami.
It's just delicious. It's just incredibly tasty flavour, and it naturally occurs in foods such as cheese, tomatoes, mushrooms, seaweed, fish, meat, and it's added to food to enhance those kinds of savoury flavours.
Do you know why they call it umami?
Because it makes you say, ooh, mommy.
You got the joke there. Yes. Yes, Anne with me. Let me say my own joke, right? Let me say my own joke.
Well, in the next slide, we're going to learn why they actually call it umami. Because the word umami was coined by the same person who discovered and isolated MSG as a kind of flavour compound. Kikunai Ikeda discovered and isolated MSG in 1908 when searching for the source of the delicious savoury flavour imparted by kombu to soups, which he called umami. He developed a process for extracting MSG from wheat and soybeans and named the crystals Ajinomoto, or essence of flavour, which was the name of the company that he founded to manufacture MSG. And
A lot of tasty things come from soybeans, aren't they?
soy
sauce?
So many. But this is just true of like every staple crop that just like masses and masses of people have relied on for a really long time. We've just developed like incredible methods of getting the most out of them. And umami literally translates as delicious taste from Japanese. It's just really tasty, just real tasty flavours that you want more of in your food.
It doesn't. You're saying it doesn't mean oh, mummy.
It's not quite, but I don't think it's a coincidence when you get these like really onomatopoeic words that describe like really basic feelings, right? It's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah. So today, MSG is typically extracted from fermented cornstarch, sugarcane, or beet.
That's
And
interesting.
Yeah,
They get sugar and MSG from the same plant. There's like two fundamentals to, modern cooking.
It seems a bit wrong to get MSG from sugarcane. They should be calling it MSG cane, right?
They should turn it into little candy rocks.
Can you imagine that though? Going to Southend-on-Sea and getting, instead of like a rock of candy, like a sweet stick rock, you get MSG rock.
Generally,
Imagine sucking on that.
It might be a bit disappointing. I don't think it'll be the flavour that people expect from such a shape. Yeah.
Whenever I've added too much MSG to something, it's been really unpleasant. Like a little bit, you're absolutely golden. Too much
Yeah.
is
Just like, if you add too much salt
no.
to something, it's
Yeah.
horrible.
You're ruining my dreams. I've got hopes and dreams, and you're both ruining them. One day we'll make some rock MSG.
We'll
that's
go
going to
right
be
now.
our first
That's
merchandise. Next slide.
And this lovely diagram of how MSG is created was produced by the company Ajinomoto, which was the original company created by the person who discovered and isolated that MSG compound in the first place. And I've got a lovely little packet of the same right here.
Oh.
Nice.
Made in the EU by Ajinomoto Foods Europe SAS.
Yeah. So we've got this fairly, this incredibly common flavour compound that's naturally occurring in food that has been extracted so that it can be added as a flavour enhancer. It's extremely delicious. It's you would use it basically. Have you used MSG, Jem?
Not really. It's not something that... So my mum's the sort of person who believes in the fads and stuff, so we never really had it
Right.
growing up, so I never really used it as a seasoning. And like, even when I was trained as a chef, you wouldn't use MSG within a kitchen like that.
Right. That's so interesting, because it really, comes into the next slide. But basically, you would use it in meals where you want to boost those kind of savoury flavours, so like soups and stews, or as like a seasoning. In places where you'd use salt, it's usually very delicious to use some MSG either instead of or as well as salt. And it's
presumably
salt.
MSG
It's got sodium
is basically
in it as
salt.
well.
It's sodium, right?
Yeah, it's the salt. What was the definition before? The sodium salt of glutamic acid. So it's just a sort of version of glutamates, which is a bit more broad. It's a type of glutamate that is in its salt form. So it's got sodium in it.
One sodium. I think it's lower sodium than salt is. So if you reduce your salt quantity and increase your MSG quantity, you can reduce your sodium intake.
If MSG is naturally occurring in our food anyway, seems fairly innocuous, and is delicious, is the essence of flavour, is the compound that is responsible for that umami flavour, which most of us find extremely tasty, why does it have such a bad reputation? Well, it may or may not surprise you to learn that the answer is largely racism.
Of course it
Mostly
is.
racism.
Of course it is. We can never have a good thing. There's no such thing as having a good thing, right?
It all began with Chinese-American Dr. Robert Homan Kwok in 1968. He wrote a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine. For several years since I have been in this country, I have experienced a strange syndrome whenever I have eaten out in a Chinese restaurant. Numbness at the back of the neck, gradually radiating to both arms and the back, and general weakness and palpitation. And he floated a number of reasons for these symptoms occurring, including salt content, soy sauce, cooking wine, or MSG. Obviously, not a particularly scientific statement in the first place. Very kind of exploratory. I tend to feel bad after I've eaten an enormous takeaway.
You say that's just high cholesterol, isn't it?
This is just one guy. He's not responsible for what followed, but unfortunately, his letter kind of caught onto a current of fear around bad chemicals in food and global corporate profit interests superseding human health and safety, and specifically xenophobia that treated Chinese and Asian cooking as particularly suspect. So after this letter, there followed a number of dodgy scientific studies that associated MSG specifically with headaches and nausea and Chinese restaurant syndrome. Actually now has an entry in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and it's literally just listing those same symptoms that this one guy just wrote a letter about, every time I go eat out, I feel this way. These are the symptoms associated with Chinese restaurant syndrome, which was given a ridiculous amount of legitimacy as a thing at all.
Yeah.
And those are still, if you look up what's bad about MSG, what are the symptoms associated with MSG, they still literally just list the the same things that this guy wrote in this one letter.
That's right. So it feels like people are just copying someone's homework.
Yeah, but for decades and to disastrous effect.
I'm sure this guy just didn't intend for this. I mean, I don't know. I never met the man, but if he's given multiple possibilities about what the cause could be,
right,
then saying, oh yes, no, it's definitely MSG because that sounds like a chemical to me, and I don't eat chemicals, even though, you know, everything you eat is chemicals.
Yeah, like E numbers are.
It is an E number.
Yeah, everything is like basically
an...
everything in your food has an E number attached to it. Like even just salt and sugar, they have E numbers.
Right.
But then you also have E numbers for like food dyes and flavorings and stuff, which I mean companies do use E numbers to hide certain things. Like there are some food dyes which are made out of like bugs, which maybe they don't want to put on the back of their sweets.
Might
to
not
put
feel like it's good marketing.
Yeah. So like you can understand why people would have that anxiety around things like what's going into my food, because people like big corporations do sometimes hide behind chemical names and E number names and all those sorts of things specifically to mislead people into what they're eating.
Yeah, it comes from a very understandable place of being a little suspicious about all of these, you know, long chemical names on the back of your food. Like you obviously want to, like, clarity over what those things mean and what they mean for your body is really, really important. MSG just happens to literally be something that's like organically occurring in food, and that you decide you want a little more of. Hey, I want a little squeeze of lemon juice in this. I want some mint flavor in here. It's like just like anything else. So there's now been a lot of pushback against specifically Chinese restaurant syndrome, because it just comes off as obviously racist, because that's what it is. But sometimes you'll see it kind of shifted. So instead they'll talk about MSG syndrome complex, which they're still listing those same those same symptoms that this one guy wrote in this letter to the Journal of Medicine, and they're just calling it MSG symptom complex instead of Chinese restaurant syndrome. And despite the kind of moral panic that was whipped up for decades around MSG use, specifically in reference to Asian cooking and Chinese meals at restaurants, MSG was, throughout in wide use in many of the sort of, many of the processed foods that we eat, like Doritos and things like that.
It's delicious.
The whole while, and still is, because it makes things tasty, right? And I think this is probably part of why the kind of myth of MSG being hazardous kind of persists, because this campaign of like MSG is dangerous was successful in stopping like people from using MSG in their own, like incorporating it into their own home cooking, just like they would with salt, just like is common, across Asia and Asian cooking. But it is still used in sort of just in snack foods and like lots of just ready food that you would buy at the supermarket, because it's effective, it tastes good. Why not? They, often they're not even gonna, they're not gonna sort of point to it in the label. So I think that's part of why this like MSG as bad myth has persisted, because even people who don't specifically associate it with like Chinese restaurants and Asian cooking will still particularly associate it with kind of junk foods and snack foods, because of the success of it being stigmatized in people's home cooking and restaurant cooking.
There are more than enough products as well that have caught on to the fact that people don't like MSG, and so advertise themselves as not having MSG, regardless of the fact that MSG isn't like a particularly bad thing. It might make you eat more of something. Like you probably eat more Doritos than you would otherwise
good,
because
like
it tastes better
or
because
onion
it's got
powder
MSG
or
in it.
paprika
Exactly.
oil,
Yeah.
everything else. Yeah, exactly.
Well,
they say it takes a lie. A lie can go halfway across the world before the truth can put his trousers on. So, and this is one of those instances, right?
Yeah.
So, and people
Right, and I think
will see that initial lie of like, oh, MSG is bad, but not think to look at any other sort of contrary evidence in the future, because like they're not gonna the news are not gonna do like a 20-minute report on how they were wrong that this thing that they said was bad is not bad.
I had plenty of, when I worked in a Japanese restaurant, I had plenty of customers come in and tell me that they couldn't have MSG, and I always felt sad for them and basically told them to go away because everything we had contained MSG.
Right, it would be like coming in and saying, I can't have salt in my food. Like, any salt. Like, there's going to be salt involved in most cooking.
Yeah. One of our earliest ever episodes was about how, like, sometimes you just need to just not... there's nothing bad with... Nothing is inherently bad. It's about not going massive amount, like a donut is going to be fine for you. Just don't have 20 donuts in one go.
Yeah, this is we're going to be you're remembering the charcoal in food episode that I did that I'm very pleased with, and we will be returning to James Wong's opinions on this.
Oh, really?
The customer that I felt saddest for, because lots of them would just like really express disappointment. They're like, well, I've eaten your food before and I didn't know. And I was like, well, if you've eaten it before and you're fine and you've come back, then I don't know what to say to you.
It just shows like how, to what an extreme degree, a very, very normal ingredient that is genuinely just naturally occurring in food anyway is stigmatized and exceptionalized to such a bizarre degree.
But I had one woman who was like, I always really liked cooking with MSG. I had never had any issue with MSG being in my food, but then one time I went out and I ate way too much Chinese food and I felt really bad the next day, and then somebody told me it was probably because I had too much MSG, and it's like, it's because you had too much food. I'm not going to argue with you about this right now, but it's because you had too much food, but you just didn't eat it anymore.
Oh dear.
It's just, you felt sick because you ate too much. That's
Now Merriam-Webster have updated their definition of Chinese restaurant syndrome, and they've added a note. The term Chinese restaurant syndrome was coined in the late 1960s following reports of people having bad reactions to food seasoned with monosodium glutamate in Chinese restaurants. Research in the years since has failed to establish a clear link between those adverse reactions and the consumptions of MSG, and the term Chinese restaurant syndrome has been criticised as misleading and potentially offensive. It has been replaced in medical literature by MSG symptom complex. Wow. So, as I was saying, just as much bunk science, just as much biased based on, a heritage of racism exceptionalizing the use of MSG in cooking, even while it was being widely used in like mass-produced food products. They've just replaced it with slightly nicer sounding words.
I like how it says underneath there, dated, sometimes offensive.
Yeah, sometimes offensive. So next we've got our lovely pal Sauce Stash.
Wow.
Showing off the delicious MSG.
I mean, the look in
that picture's not real though.
The look in his eyes.
It's a thumbnail, so it's edited. I can confirm, whilst the powder in itself, it's not like awful tasting, you don't really want like,
Yeah.
Go on, do a dab.
Yeah. Well,
Okay, now do a shot.
I would say it's better than doing the same thing with salt.
Oh yeah, it's less salty. It mostly just tastes kind of salty though, and a little kind of savoury taste.
Can you imagine doing tequila?
Nice
doing a tequila shot with, instead of doing salt, you do MSG.
Yeah, that would be really good. The interesting thing about MSG, genuinely, is like if you look up pictures of it, it's really long crystals, like really long kind of salt crystals. So it kind of looks pretty in pictures. I'm sure it'd look nice around the rim of a glass. Yeah, so now many cooks are publicly pushing back on the fear of MSG and explaining this history that MSG is perfectly safe, that the kind of fears have been scientifically debunked. And Sauce Stash, I think, is an interesting example as well, because he's a vegan YouTube chef, and all his videos are looking for, lots of interesting ways to kind of substitute meat. And MSG is really, really important for what he does, because it's literally that like savoury flavour that people associate with meat that you want to be reproducing in kind of meat substitutes. And lots of the alternatives that you would use, like yeast extract, mushroom, things like that, just are foods that are naturally high in MSG anyway.
So you're already doing it. You're already doing it. You're already doing it.
Glutamates. Exactly.
But then a lot of vegans do fall into the category of like highly suspicious of anything that seems chemical.
Exactly. That's why I think it's so interesting as well, because I feel like it's kind of an interesting intervention to come from specifically vegan chefs, because it's probably quite well targeted to actually kind of reverse that impact a little, I think. So now that a lot of that kind of junk science and fear-mongering around MSG syndrome complex has kind of been debunked and is receiving a little less attention and a little more pushback, there's kind of a kind of new wave of anti-MSG justification coming through the concept of hyper-palatable foods.
Hyper-palatable?
Hyper-palatable.
Delicious.
This is what hyper-palatable foods means. Here's a delightful tweet from James Wong. Hyper-palatable is a sciencey sounding word for very tasty. The aim of anyone who has ever cooked. We need to be careful of letting cultural ideas bleed into scientific discourse. So basically this concept of hyper-palatable foods is what people are throwing around as kind of explanation for obesity, for unwellness, rather than focusing on people's lack of access, money, time to source healthy, nutritious foods that they enjoy and are good for them. People are instead focusing on that they're trying to blame sort of hyper-palatable foods, which again is tying into this kind of like, you can see how people come up with these ideas of this, like the profit incentive is to serve you with hyper-palatable foods that you want to buy more of, that taste super tasty to you but don't nutritionally fulfill you, and you just buy more and more and more of them. So they're trying to blame the food products themselves rather than kind of people's actual circumstances.
It's easier to find a sort of a nonsense bogeyman than it is to actually address the structural inequalities of the world that result in people having access to unhealthy foods and not having the time to create healthy meals, those sorts of things.
Yeah, exactly. So in James Wong's article in the New Scientist, the article's called "Hyperpalatable Foods Are a Modern Bogeyman, but What Even Are They?" He describes hyperpalatability in this way. In the secret labs of corporate giants, scientists are engineering foods with hyperpalatable formulas to hijack our brains' reward mechanisms, turning us into addicts for their products. This claim has been the subject of books, documentaries, and the columns of investigative journalists, and is continually amplified by social media. A According to the narrative, the driving force behind the rise in obesity rates in recent decades is the hyperpalatability of certain modern formulations of food, specifically designed to trigger a psychological bliss point where those who consume them lose all self-control.
Wow.
And yeah, and
psychological bliss point is an interesting term.
Yes. And like in reading around this, like they really use this like pseudo addiction kind of language to talk about food. Like it's very much like do not get addicted to water kind of language. It's like, okay, but we need food to eat every single day to keep us alive.
Yes.
And in the wise words of James Wong, repeating from our earlier episode that Jen referenced, there are no bad foods, there are only bad diets.
I mean, that's all well and good, but the original recipe to Coca-Cola did have cocaine in it.
That's true. That is dodgy as fuck.
So I'm not saying that like today's Coca-Cola is a hyperpalatable food, but the original Coca-Cola was definitely a hyperpalatable food.
Yeah. And yeah, I think it's really worth thinking about this kind of legacy around MSG and how it kind of links in with this idea of hyperpalatable foods as this boogeyman, as James Wong describes, because I feel like it shares a lot of similarity. So like all the same hallmarks as the thinking that brought about this scrutiny of MSG as an ingredient, like the idea of, you know, companies putting bad chemicals in your food, not caring about your health. Like, you know, obviously capitalism is bad, and profit as a motive is one that creates countless problems in our society and in our health. So this kind of scrutiny and suspicion generally is, you know, really understandable. But it kind of doesn't really line up.
There's so many cases where people are really suspicious of capitalism and capitalists, but they don't like have the kind of class awareness to realize exactly what they're saying when people talk about the Illuminati. I just think, well, you've seen a real problem, which is that there's some very wealthy, powerful people and conspiracies, but like, you know, direct that in a more class-based analysis.
Yeah, you can criticize the problem and actually criticize the problem rather than coming up with some thing else that is easy to blame.
Yeah.
Oh, no, yeah. And easier to feel like you can do something about, like you can try to avoid MSG in your food if you feel like they're trying to force it on you, so
yeah,
that
exactly.
you can take some control in your own.
And that solves my problem. It's absolutely tight. Like helps, you know, it gets popular because people feel like this is something that they can exercise control over very easily, whereas, you know, people still have power to, but they have more diffuse and struggle to do things like make sure that working class people in their environment have access to good food in the first place, have the time to prepare it, you know, like
have the education to make use of those things as well.
Yeah, so like because of this kind of undue scrutiny that MSG has already received, it receives kind of like excess attention in this kind of discussion of hyperpalatable foods, even though it's literally just there with every other kind of flavor enhancer, every other kind of condiment, every other kind of, you know, ingredient that you would add to food: onions, paprika, salt, lemon, mint, like all these things you add to make your food taste good. MSG is just another one of them. But it suddenly becomes suspicious when you can apply the label of hyperpalatable to it. It does something dangerous and scary to food. When I was preparing the presentation, I just it just popped up in my YouTube feed, and like Adam Ragusa video about MSG, where he was kind of similarly, like, explaining the fear-mongering around it, I'd already put down in my notes, like, about hyperpalatable foods and how it, is kind of this kind of bizarre spinning of our, natural desire to make food taste good as something suspect and dangerous. How that would be kind of spun against MSG. And then in that Adam Ragusa video, he talks through this kind of, like, dodgy background to excess scrutiny on MSG, and then he has on an academic who has, like, done lots of writing about MSG, who comes on and says basically, like, yes, that was racist, but it's a shame that they've kind of overcompensated, and now valid inquiries into potential risks and issues with MSG are shut down. And what she raises as valid concerns about the use of MSG, like particularly MSG, is this concept of hyperpalatability, and literally just that it makes food taste good. So why is MSG different to any other ingredient in that sense? Any other ingredient that you would want to add to your food? And he even does this, like, really, like, junk, like, personal experiment kind of thing to kind of, like, prove the concept. He's like, and this suits my experience, because when I add MSG to nutritionally rich foods, basically, when I add MSG to tomato sauce, I don't notice any difference. It just kind of tastes the same to me. But when I add MSG to really boring, nutritionally junk foods like, a corn chip or whatever, or, like crisps, basically, that's when it really tastes good. And that's evidence that it is a concern, because it only makes junk food taste good, basically, is what he says.
Tomatoes being one of the things that we decided at the beginning already has MSG in it, like as a naturally occurring compound.
Exactly.
I look forward to reading your open letter in the New England Journal now.
Yeah. I just found it so silly that when he's just done this whole video explaining, like, the kind of, like, ridiculous, overblown fear-mongering around MSG, to just kind of, like, pull off the top of his head, like, on the spot, like, new reasons to apply scrutiny to just a regular ingredient that... Like,
it sounds to me like he came to the video with a conclusion.
Yeah.
And then realised the evidence didn't quite match up, but still wanted the same conclusion.
Or that he just wanted to be, like, fair and balanced, and sometimes you need to both sides things.
Yeah, I think that's very much the kind of approach, like,